never thought that this could happen to me. An ordinary guy, an ordinary life, without any oddities. But apparently, this is the whole irony. You always think that such things happen to someone else, and then everything changes overnight. It was summer, July. The heat was unbearable, and the only escape from the stuffiness was my parents' old country house in a small town on the border with Pennsylvania. The house had been empty for a long time. Only sometimes my parents came here in the spring to put everything in order. That year, I decided to spend a few days alone there. I just needed to get away from the hustle and bustle of the city. First night passed quietly. The usual silence of the village night stood around, interrupted only by the noise of the forest and the occasional sounds from the road. But on the second night, something changed. I couldn't sleep. I was tossing and turning in bed, as if something was in the way. It was a strange feeling, as if something was wrong in the house. About 11 o'clock in the morning, I heard the first sound. It was the creaking of the floorboards on the second floor. The house was old, and such sounds were not uncommon. This creaking was different. It was repeated, as if someone was cautiously walking along the corridor. I put it down to the wind, or maybe an animal sneaking in. But when I went upstairs to check, I didn't find anything. The second sound was much stranger. About an hour after the first one, I heard something again, but this time it was a sound like a light tapping, as if someone was gently beating on the window. The bedroom window was closed, and nothing could be seen from the outside except the black sky. I felt a chill run down my spine. Everything inside me told me to leave, but I stayed. That was my first mistake. By morning, I had barely slept. The nervous tension did not let go, and barely audible sounds could be heard throughout the house. Rustles, creaks, some quiet, barely perceptible whispers. I didn't realize then that it wasn't my paranoia. All this time, someone was really there, nearby. On the third day, it got worse. At first, I noticed that my things started to move. Nothing global, just little things, as if someone had touched them but returned them to their place in a slightly different way. I've always had a habit of leaving my keys on the same shelf by the door, but this time, they ended up on the kitchen table. Couldn't figure out how they got there. It was all starting to drive me crazy. By the evening of the same day, I heard something that I still can't forget. It was a loud knock on the door, almost like a fist bump. I jumped up and ran out into the corridor. When I opened the door, there was no one outside. It was all some kind of bad dream that I couldn't wake up from. At night, I heard footsteps outside the bedroom door. Heavy, slow footsteps approaching the bed. Every time I jumped out of bed and turned on the light, there was nothing. I was starting to go crazy. I didn't understand what was going on. But the scariest thing was that these footsteps didn't stop, even when I was standing in the room and listening. That night, I decided not to go to bed. The tension was too strong, and intuition screamed that something was coming. I sat on the bed, listening to every sound. Every creak seemed louder and closer, and the feeling that I was not alone became unbearable. Time passed slowly. The minute hands on the clock sounded like heartbeats. About 2 o'clock in the morning, I heard something heavy fall to the floor below, on the ground floor. It wasn't a random sound. It was a sound that could be compared to the fall of something large, as if someone had dropped furniture or a heavy box. I didn't want to go and check, but something inside made me get out of bed. Cursing myself for my bravery, or rather stupidity, I quietly went downstairs, trying not to make a sound. When I entered the living room, my heart stopped. There was a table on the floor in the middle of the room, the same one that always stood against the wall. But it was impossible to simply move it without making a noise. It was too heavy. At that moment, I realized I am not alone in this house. Someone or something moved the table, and it could be nearby. I froze in place, feeling my blood run cold. The seconds turned into minutes, and the silence became deafening. I felt the air in the room getting denser, and at one point I thought I heard someone breathing. Couldn't stay in this house anymore. I started backing towards the door, trying to keep my eyes on the table, when suddenly I heard a voice. It was a faint, barely audible whisper coming from somewhere behind the wall. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound paralyzed me. Everything inside me screamed that I had to run, but I stood rooted to the spot. The voice got louder, and it seemed to me that he was calling my name. Then I realized that someone or something knows more about me than I could have imagined. I stood paralyzed with fear, peering into the darkness from where this whisper came. His heart was pounding so hard that it seemed to resound throughout the house. The voice became even louder. Now it sounded not like a whisper, like a muffled conversation, as if someone was trying to speak from another room. I knew that staying here was certain death, but my feet seemed rooted to the floor. I had to summon all my willpower to take a step back, and as soon as I did, the voice stopped. But it got even worse. Suddenly, there was a sound that I cannot describe in words, like someone scratching against the wall, but not with claws, but with something heavy and hard, like metal on concrete. The sound came from the ceiling, as if someone was moving slowly and purposefully right above me, tearing through layer after layer. I knew I had to leave, but my thoughts were confused. Couldn't figure out where to run, because it seemed like everything was becoming a trap. I slowly began to retreat to the door, feeling goosebumps running down my skin. When I was almost at the exit, I heard a crash behind me. It was the sound of glass breaking into small pieces. Without turning around, I rushed to the door, barely controlling the trembling in my hands, opened it and jumped out into the corridor. But what I saw made my heart stop. There were glass shards on the floor along the walls, and they were everywhere, as if someone had broken all the windows at once. But that wasn't the worst part. I noticed footprints among the fragments. Bare footprints leading from the living room and disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. My mind refused to believe what I was seeing. The marks of bare feet, too big, with long curved fingers, as if they did not belong to a person. They stretched across the floor and disappeared into the shadows of the corridor, where the light of the lamp could not penetrate. Horror gripped me. I felt a cold sweat running through my whole body. I knew that somewhere in the depths of the darkness, beyond my vision, there was something lurking that was just waiting for me to take the next step. The silence in the house was almost deafening, but I knew that this calmness was only the calm before the storm. I started to slowly back away, trying not to make a sound, when suddenly I heard a creak. It was the same grinding noise as before, but now it was coming from the walls, as if something heavy was moving inside the house, moving closer and closer to my location. The sound grew louder, more intense, and I felt panic overwhelm me. I had to run, but where? The house became a trap. Every exit seemed closed, and with every second I realized more and more that going outside was not an option. Something kept me from leaving this place. I felt like a hunted animal, deprived of the opportunity to escape. The footsteps in the hallway grew louder, and as if in response to my fear, the lamps began to flicker. Dim light appeared and disappeared, creating bizarre shadows on the walls. I knew that once the lights went out completely, it would all be over. As if to reinforce my fears, the lamps flickered with renewed vigor before pitch darkness reigned in the house. I heard them in the dark. The steps, slow, measured, they were approaching. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but with every heartbeat, the sound got closer. The footsteps seemed to echo inside me. I felt heavy breathing coming towards me as cold air filled the room. Suddenly, something touched my arm. Light, almost imperceptible, but enough to make the heart stop. I couldn't see in the dark, but I knew it was something standing right in front of me. I'd smell it, sharp, rotting, like something long dead and decaying. The smell made me gasp, and I realized that I couldn't stay here a second longer. Taking off, I rushed in the opposite direction, almost not seeing the way in front of me. I stumbled and fell in the dark, breaking my knees and arms, but the adrenaline wouldn't let me stop. I was rushing through the house as if death itself was chasing me. Footsteps, breathing, smell, all this followed me closely. When I got to the stairs, I heard something behind me start to whisper. This whisper called my name again, but now the voice was distorted, as if someone or something was trying to reproduce human speech, but did not know how to do it correctly. I rushed down the stairs, jumping 2 or 3 at a time, almost falling off the stairs. The house seemed to stretch out, as if the end of the corridor was moving away with every step I took. I rushed into the hallway, slammed the door behind me, but suddenly realized that the house was trapped. The door that was supposed to lead to the exit was blocked, as if someone had deliberately closed it from the inside. I felt the lock, but my hands were shaking so much that I could barely clench my fingers into a fist. I knew that I didn't have time, that whatever it was getting closer and closer. Despair overwhelmed me, and I began to rush around the hallway, trying to find another way out. Suddenly, my eyes noticed an old wooden staircase leading to the basement. I never went down there. My parents always said that the basement was unsafe, but right now it was the only possible way out, the only place to hide. My breathing was erratic, there was a buzz in my ears, but I opened the door to the basement and, almost without thinking, rushed downstairs. The basement was cold, damp, and almost unlit. The only light source was an old lantern hanging on the wall, blinking as if it was ready to go out at any moment. I sat down in a corner, trying to catch my breath and collect my thoughts. The trembling in my arms and legs did not subside. My heart was still pounding. It seemed that I could not take a deep breath. I knew I was trapped. I didn't know what to do next. But when the footsteps stopped, I heard a sound that I will never forget. It was the sound of a lighter. There was a sharp click, and a dim light spread across the room. I looked up and saw a figure standing at the entrance to the basement. She was human, but her face was hidden in shadow. The light of the lighter illuminated only her hand, and the hood pulled over her face. This man was completely calm, which made him even more intimidating. He slowly raised his hand with the lighter, and I saw that he had something metallic in his other hand. It was a canister of gasoline. Everything in me went cold. This man obviously didn't just come to scare me. He came to finish what he started. He began slowly pouring gasoline around the perimeter of the basement, and the smell of fuel instantly filled the room, interrupting even the stench of rot. I jumped to my feet. My heart was racing, my blood froze in my veins. I realized that my fear of what was hunting me in the house was nothing compared to the horror that stood in front of me now. It was not a ghost, not a creature from another world. It was a man who deliberately caused this whole nightmare, and he clearly wasn't going to let me go alive. I rushed to the door, trying to escape. It was locked. The man took his time, as if enjoying my desperate attempts. When the canister was empty, he raised the lighter to eye level and looked at me as if I were doomed. At that moment, I realized that there was no more time or chance. I was trapped. "This is the end," he whispered, and the next moment the lighter flew into a gasoline puddle. I jumped to the side, trying to hide behind a concrete column, when the flames instantly burst out. The fire instantly engulfed the basement. The heat was unbearable. Everything was on fire, and I realized that this was not just a house, but a trap that was meant for me from the very beginning. This man, this monster in human form, had planned all this from the very beginning, and I realized that he was the one who was chasing me from the very beginning. Panic seized me. I tried to find a way out, but the fire had already cut off my path. The only thing I could do was fight to the last, but somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew that this was the end. I was on my knees, coughing from the smoke, feeling the flames coming closer. And at the last moment, when it seemed that everything was already lost, I heard the sounds of sirens outside. Firefighters. Someone may have noticed the smoke and called for help. I raised my head, and despite the horror, faint hope of salvation flashed, but the fire was already too close. The room filled with smoke, and my vision began to fade. All I could do was close my eyes and pray that at least